This is remarkable, especially when we look at the history of the last 20 years, because the reality is from 1970 to 1990, as I write in my book, the religious right did grow. They grew dramatically with their mega churches. But after 1990, the religious right rather leveled off. They haven't lost that much, but they haven't gained that much either. But you know who has gained? Who has gained is the secular group. The non-religious group has grown dramatically, and yet we have not asserted ourselves. We have not asserted ourselves to affect the political process in a real and significant way, and we really need to do so because the theocrats are deeply embedded in our government, and the problems they have created are pervasive. When I offered to you a 10-point vision of a secular America, unfortunately, I document with specific details and examples that every one of those 10 principles are violated by religious bias in current American law. We need to understand the gravity of this problem, and we need to do something about it. You know, I get concerned because sometimes when I talk to secular groups, I notice a tenor, a tone, where they say, well, we are quite smarter than thou because we don't believe in these mythical things. Well, I tell you, as a 10-year politician, what I think is pretty smart is that the religious right has grown to have veto power over one of two major political parties in the most powerful country in the history of the human race. Now that's pretty strategic, and that's pretty smart, and we need to be ready to work to counteract and make a change. So what if we had a plan? What if we had a real plan, a specific plan, outwardly directed from secular organizations to change the rest of American society towards secularism in a pragmatic way? So I know you're looking at me and you're asking me, yes, Sean, yes, tell us about Australia. So I'm going to tell you about Australia. I'm going to talk about that. So I did a 14-city tour in Australia and New Zealand, and it was marvelous and interesting and educational. But one of the things that struck me is I spoke to the organizers of huge secular conventions that they had down there in Australia, bigger than in North America, bigger than in Europe, huge conventions. And one of the organizers told me, it was such a great experience. We're here. We're proud. We feel so good about ourselves. It was jubilant. And then they did it again. They had an even bigger convention, and they beat North America, and they beat Europe again, and had these huge, vast crowds. But the second time, the organizers told me it didn't quite feel the same, because they said, well, we already said we're here. We already know we're here. Now what? And they asked me to come down and talk to them about public policy. And I'm very proud to report now they have organized the first ever secular policy-focused organization to speak out on church-state separation in New Zealand and in Australia, so that they are not simply debating the philosophy, which is important, but debating the issues affected by that philosophy. And I think we need to have that focus as well. So I know you're asking me, Sean, tell me about Iowa. So that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you about Iowa now. Many of you may be familiar with a little bit of history about the state of Iowa. There was this guy who was governor of Georgia, and nobody had ever heard of him outside of the state of Georgia. A guy named Jimmy Carter, happens to be a nuclear engineer. And he had this plan. He sort of took a page from a guy named Sun Tzu from a few centuries ago, who said, emerge to their surprise and appear where you were not expected. And so what Jimmy Carter did, because if you look back in history, Jack Kennedy, Barry Goldwater, they didn't go to Iowa. It wasn't on the radar as a political stop as it is now. So what Jimmy Carter did is he created something called the Peanut Brigade, basically a bunch of Georgians. And they bussed them into the state of Iowa, and they were well-trained, and they were polite, and they were hardworking, and they worked months and said, hear about this really nice, principled governor of Georgia. And Jimmy Carter won that caucus, and he springboarded into national media attention, and that's how he became president of the United States. And the political process in America has forever since been changed within this small state, so that now things are dramatically saturated within the state of Iowa. So I'm going to turn to someone who is not a nuclear engineer, Michelle Bachmann. What I want you to notice about this picture is the Iowa caucus, January 2012. That's January. You're wearing a parka. She's wearing a sleeveless outfit there. And look behind her. Look behind her at the crowd of cameras. because it is dramatic. This process in Iowa goes on for months. Let's face it, Michelle Bachmann, as a realistic matter, never really had a chance to get that Republican nomination, and yet she is mobbed by reporters many months before the actual caucus date itself. See, the media is looking for a story in the state of Iowa. They're looking for a story for a year. The national media is looking for a story for a year, and the press wants that story, and we're going to give them a story. It's called Secularity USA, Get Religious Bias Out of Government, and I'm going to tell you what it involves.